the Christian canon is, as you said, like it doesn't present DRA as an insignificant one, right, or monolithic concept, but instead the biblical authors, they showcase both the significance and complexity of it. And so you do offer a framework of kind of four polarities, right, to demonstrate this complexity. And so maybe could you walk us through what those are?
That's right. Yeah. So in order to try to describe the kinds of complexities, right, that the biblical authors are willing to conceptualize DRA with, I use these four polarities that, again, I'm not saying this is exhaustive, right? This isn't the only way to describe the ways that biblical authors describe DRA, but I do think it's true to their intentions. So the four polarities are retributive versus non-retributive, active versus passive, mediated versus immediate, and then eternal versus non-eternal. So just briefly, what that means is for the first polarity, the biblical authors are sometimes explicit that God's negative influence is an act of retribution, right? So there are particular cases where the biblical authors want readers to understand that God is exercising this influence as a retributive judgment, a retributive punishment on sins that have already been committed, right? So you think, for example, of Romans chapter 1, where Paul describes humanity as a whole as being consigned to degrading passions, to a darkened mind. And it's because human beings have already chosen to reject God's revelation of himself in creation, that we have chosen to worship created things rather than the creator, that we have refused to give God the honor and the thanks that he deserves. And because of that, as a punishment for our idolatry, we are handed over and consigned to our sinful and degraded passions, right? So that's an example of what I call a retributive DRA. But the biblical authors don't always describe DRA as an act of retribution. In fact, there are other cases where they describe God as having other kinds of motivations behind this influence. This would include, for example, in the Exodus story, where Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And when Moses describes God's reasoning for this, it's in order to demonstrate his power. It's in order to provide Israel with a memorial of his acts of judgment. It's so that God's name would be honored among the nations, right? Moses there is describing God's motivation, and he does not say that retribution was the reason or the rationale behind his treatment of Pharaoh. You have that similarly in Romans 9 with Paul talking about vessels of wrath who've been prepared for destruction. And the reason is, Paul says, what if God, because he desired to make known his power, right, for the benefit of vessels of mercy. Right. So there are, again, a host of examples. And in each case, I tried to investigate and categorize, what does the biblical author want us to understand about God's motivations? And to me, it became clear that sometimes it was an act of retribution. Other times it wasn't. The other polarity, the second one, has to do with whether God uses other agents to affect this influence. So I call that mediated DRA, where there's a third or fourth agent involved in carrying out God's negative influence. So you can think about Isaiah, for example, where commissioned Isaiah to preach, to proclaim the truth of God's coming judgments. And God sent Isaiah knowing that the effect that he would have on Israel would be to blind their eyes so that they don't see, to deafen their ears so that they don't hear, precisely so that they might not turn and be healed, right? So there, God's agency is described as being exercised through a mediating figure, in that case, Isaiah. In other cases, it's a lying spirit. Matthew seems to describe not just Matthew, but the synoptic gospel writers say that Jesus intentionally taught in parables, for example, in order to prevent certain people from understanding. So those cases, there's a mediating agent involved. And then you have other examples where God is described as taking a more direct role, right? So I call that immediate DRA, where there is no mediating figure. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is a prime example of that.
Yeah.
Active versus passive has to do with the kind of agency involved. So God is sometimes described as taking active actions in order to affect this influence. That's the active form of DRA. The passive form of DRA is where God is described as withholding that which would have prevented individuals from taking course of action that would lead to their condemnation, right? So I think of Deuteronomy 29, for example, where Moses says that God has not given you a heart to understand or ears to hear. Where there it seems Moses seems to say that because God has not done something, right? He hasn't provided Israel really with the spiritual and moral capacities to respond rightly to God's revelation.
Yeah.
Moses was sure that they were going to break the Sinai covenant and experience the covenant curses. And Moses says that God is in the future going to circumcise their hearts. So this isn't something, it's not like God couldn't have done this. He certainly could have, and he will. Moses says that he will, and yet he chose not to. And so that's what I call a passive form of DRA, where it's deliberate inaction. That is the means by which God exercises this influence. And then lastly, you have eternal versus non-eternal, which has to do with the kind of judgment that the biblical author has in mind. So throughout the Old Testament, most of the examples of DRA have to do with some form of non-eternal judgment, right? Whether we're talking about mortal death, or exile or something like that. Where again, I'm talking specifically here about what kind of judgment the biblical author has in mind or is indicating, right? So I'm not talking about, kind of in an ultimate sense, right? Theological sense. I'm just trying to explore what the biblical authors are intending to describe. And so I say that, in my view, the Old Testament authors typically have some form of non-eternal judgment in mind. But then there's also an eternal form of DRA where the biblical authors are explicit that the kind of judgment that DRA leads to is eternal, right? And so most of the examples from the New Testament, in my view, are eternal forms of DRA.